Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the first of two broadcasts to celebrate the launch or relaunch of the Historical Materialism YouTube channel. Just to say a little bit about Historical Materialism for those of you who are new to us, Historical Materialism is a collective which produces work in research in critical Marxist theory. What do we produce? Well, for starters, we produce a YouTube site. We've just relaunched it. If you look at the YouTube site, and we are directly broadcasting onto it, you will find two networks, Sexuality and Political Economy and Marxism and Disability, of which this is one of the broadcasts this afternoon, the first broadcast this afternoon. You will also find a lecture series from Sean Sayers on Hegel-Marx dialectic and sessions on Tomba's Insurgent Universality and How to be a Marxist in the Academy. I should add, our excellent friends at Haymarket have a YouTube channel, and we broadcast our book launches and some of our sessions direct through Haymarket Books, and there is a link on the site to take you directly to Haymarket Books broadcast in the Historical Materialism series. So we do broadcasts. We also do podcasts. They can be accessed through Spotify. We have a gargantuan mailing list, and frequently all the links to these things and advertisements to these things go out, and invariably we do our broadcasting using a Eventbrite page, so you're very much aware of what it is we're doing. We produce, and we began by producing a journal. This is the latest edition. The journal is, as you can see, remarkably thick for an academic journal. It's full of excellent content. This one is part one of a two-part Race and Capital, edited by or overseen by Ashok Kumar and Robert Knox, and an excellent job they did as well. We also have a book series. The book series is brought out through Brill in Leiden. When books come out, they initially come out like this, and I'm using as an example my friend Peter Drucker's excellent Sexuality and Political Economy publication, Warped, Gay Normality and Queer Anti-Capitalism. This is a substantial tome, as you can see, and comes out in hardback. A year later, or just over a year later, we have the paperback version, which is published by our friends Haymarket. This is probably the one that you will buy because it's considerably cheaper, but you can gain access to those on Brill's website. Okay, so that's historical materials. And what about today's session? Well, Ioana Cerasella is a doctoral researcher at the University of Birmingham, member of Marxism Disability Network Steering Group, and co-convener of the British Sociological Association's Theory Study Group. Her current research project explores the politics of disablement and precarious work in the UK, through which she aims to make theoretical and empirical contributions to critical political economy, disability studies, sociology, and to the thought and praxis of activist service. And her website is up on the Eventbrite page. Now, today she is going to talk about an article which you can download from the Eventbrite page, The Centrality of Disablement Subjectivation to the Reproduction of Capital. Capitalist social relations. The paper is available for you to download free, and you can read it alongside us, and some of you will have already actually started reading this. Ioana will speak for about 40-45 minutes. Then there will be time for questions. Please put your questions in the chat box on YouTube. And with that stumbling and barely coherent introduction, I will pass over to Ioana.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for inviting me to discuss this paper with you. It is really exciting to be here for the launch of, or the relaunch of the Historical Materialism YouTube channel, and I look forward to watching all the future events and also to facilitating further events alongside comrades in the Marxism and Disability Network. So I've got about 40 minutes and I've divided the talk into 4 parts, including some background information about the wider project that this paper is part of. If I don't have time for the last part, the first three will make sense on their own anyway. So the main argument is that all people who are impaired, chronically ill, neurodivergent, D-deaf, and or who experience mental distress, and who may or may not identify as being disabled, share a common experience of living under capitalism, and that is of structural disablement subjectivation through oppression and exploitation. So disablement is central and fundamental to the reproduction of capitalism. And this is an argument that I wish other activists and scholars will engage with. But before I start the presentation itself, I would like to give shout outs to the Global Political Economy Journal and its editors. So this journal is the host of the article that we'll be exploring today. And it was set up by two scholars, Monica Clua-Losada and Phoebe Moore. And I had a very positive experience of going through the review process, and I encourage everyone here to consider publishing in this journal. It was launched in 2022, and one of the aims of the journal is, and I quote, to offer a critical platform for research that integrates prevailing institutions, norms, and patterns of authority and explanatory categories. And in terms of the presentation today, I would like to make a couple of proposals. And they are, firstly, that we need to tweak and build on the impaired disabled dialectic proposed by the UPS-inspired social modelists. I propose that we analyze how capitalism and not simply society is disabling. I will highlight the analytical usefulness of my proposed terms, subjects of disablement, disabling capitalism, and disability composition. And finally, if there is time, I will explore broadly some of the implications of this framework with reference to my wider research project. Now, how did this paper come about? It is part of, as Paul mentioned, the research project called The Politics of Disablement and Precarious Work, which you can also follow on Twitter, as there is a Twitter account linked to it. And through this project in 2020, I interviewed 27 gig economy workers in various industries and on various contracts, all of whom are based in the UK. And they all identified and self-identified as being either disabled, chronically ill, experiencing mental distress, being neurodivergent, and or having impairments. About half of the participants also kept diaries about their everyday life experiences of work within and beyond their workplace. Over 8 weeks, and most of the diarists also kept or attended a post-diary interview in 2020. Now, the project's research questions relate to, firstly, identity and subjectivation, which is the topic of today's talk. But importantly, this question emerged as a result of the answers to my initial interview questions. So I didn't start the project thinking that I would necessarily look into this topic, but it became apparent as I was doing the analysis of the interviews that I needed to address this topic. Secondly, I offer empirical findings on waged and unwaged work as done by the participants of this project. And finally, I highlight the benefits of synthesizing post-68 Marxisms with the UPS-inspired social model of disability. And some of this synthesis will be coming out in a forthcoming paper if the revisions that I'll be working on soon will be accepted by the journal to which I submitted this paper. So another thing I want to really stress at the start is that political economy, sociology, and political science as disciplines have considered disability and disabled people through an individualizing and depoliticized lens, if and when disabled people and disability are mentioned at all. And at the same time, in disability studies, Marxism has been largely abandoned. And so my task here is to intervene in both those fields and to, in a way, bring them together and to revive Marxism within disability studies. Now, in terms of the paper itself, one of the key words and key concepts in the paper is that of identity. And I found Marie Moran's book, Identity and Capitalism, and her subsequent articles on this topic to be immensely insightful and exactly what I needed to engage with for this project. So Marie Moran uses cultural materialism and builds on the work of Raymond Williams and stresses how identity is a historically contingent concept, which has undergone a significant change of meaning since the 1950s. But even before then, Marie Moran has stressed how in the 16th century, identity was a marker of sameness and indivisibility of a person. And then 2 centuries later, we had the legal use of identity with the invention of identity cards, and this legal use still persists until today. And then from the mid-20th century, a historically novel and dual understanding of identity was invented. And that is personal identity and social identity. And all of this emerged alongside the emergence of consumerism versus radical politics. So in summary, identity is something that is historically contingent, and we don't know how it will be constructed and used in the future. And I just argue for an openness to future iterations of identity, although in the paper itself, I'm not arguing for a particular identity as such. Moving on, one of the things that anyone who engages with disability politics needs to be aware of is that there are different approaches to disability that have been developed over time. So just as an example, A.J. Withers identified a couple of years ago 27 models of disability, and I'll just mention a couple. The medical model or medical-centric model, cultural, liberal, postmodern, social, biopsychosocial, posthuman, charity, tragedy, and so on. So this is a very interesting and useful categorization and distinction between these models. But I find, for the purpose of this project, the distinction made by disability studies scholar Mike Oliver to be most useful. So Mike Oliver identified 2 umbrella models, in a sense. And the first one is the individual model, which is an approach that regards problems within individuals' body-minds and tries to fix people's body-minds as a way of integrating them in society. And in addition to this, I would also argue that the individual model finds solutions within individuals' body-mind as well, and within the law. So for instance, the liberal human rights model seeks to address injustices through individual human rights. Now, on the other hand, the social model emerged from a broadly socialist activist group in the 1970s in the UK called UPIAS, which stands for the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. And for them, the problem, if we are to use this term, lies in how society is organized. So society disables people with impairments. And then to be disabled, a disabled person is a political and a social identity. And this is linked to what Marie Moran wrote in her book. And for them, the distinction is between people with impairments and disabled people. So you may be born with an impairment or acquire an impairment, and you're disabled by society, so you become disabled that way. However, the social model's language has been appropriated over time, including by the DWP, which is the UK's Department for Work and Pensions, charities, and liberal academics, to the extent that it has become an umbrella model. And Vic Finkelstein, who is one of the co-founders of UPS, said in the 1990s that the social model has become a potpourri because it has lost its critical edge. And he also mentioned that he sees disability studies as having become disabling studies for the same reason. Now, there are a lot of criticisms of the social model as a consequence of the kind of move away from its Marxist roots. And some of them are, for instance, that the social model is, and I quote, old-fashioned and out of tune, and that is Goodley 2013. Shakespeare and Watson in 2002 said that the social model is an outdated ideology. And then Mikosha and Shuttleworth in 2009 said that the social model is underpinned by, and I quote, authoritarian Marxism and economic determinism. And these are the proponents of the post-humanist, liberal, critical realist, and postmodern approaches to disability studies. Now, on the other hand, we've got adherents to the social model, and in particular, the UPS-inspired social model. And I'll mention here the excellent author and activist Ellen Clifford, who is currently seeking to articulate a social model of impairment rather than of disability, and a contribution to the UPS inspired social model and its politics. And then also Bob Williams Findlay is creating an eco-social model of disability. And I would like to stress that his book is forthcoming with Pluto Press, so keep an eye on Pluto Press's website. And what I'm trying to do is to create a theory to accompany the UPS-inspired social model. And this talk is part of the larger framework that I'm trying to create with the doctoral project itself. So this is the subjects of disablement article is only one part. Now, to move on to the kind of second part of this talk, I will stress the different ways in which different terms and identities are understood across different spheres of society. So again, I'll mention being disabled, neurodivergent, chronically ill, deaf, experiencing mental distress, and having impairments. To then show how and why I wanted to look at the underlying commonalities between all of these groups. So we find, first and foremost, disagreements within society and literatures. And I'm referring here mostly to the UK because of the focus of the project. So as I mentioned before, there are different interpretations of disability through the different models. Then secondly, social modelists see the distinction between disability and impairment, whilst others don't at all. So they use disability and impairment interchangeably. Some argue that chronic illness and neurodivergence are a type of impairment, so they're developing scholarship in that area, whilst others say that, for instance, mental distress is not an impairment, and to consider mental distress an impairment would be problematically pathologizing distress. And then in some literatures, neurodivergence is treated as an advantage for productivity, reproducing productivity-based hierarchies and kind of the ideology of productivism. And in the UK, only a quarter of those who are disabled according to the law, and this is another kind of aspect of identity, identify as such, so only a quarter. And finally, some people's claims to disability are being denied by the state, employers, and other professionals, and these are especially feminized and racialized people, and especially those who, for instance, have a chronic illness. They might be told by their GP that their experience is psychosomatic and that basically their claim to disability is invalid and they should not be qualified for research, for reasonable adjustments or any types of, for instance, support. So we see here like a rejection, a denial, and also reservations in relation to the use of the terms disabled and impairment or being impaired. Now, disagreements are also found in academia, as I already have shown. But in addition to that, I would say that the language and concepts used in relation to disability and disabled people is, for want of a better expression, all over the place. So this happens both within disability studies and beyond. Very often, the terms used are not very clear or not very well defined, and you're left to wonder what is the actual meaning of these terms and the arguments made in some papers. And even now, identity-related questions on disability-related mailing lists can lead to many heated responses. And this reflects the lack of consensus and the different interpretations of disability, some of which are cultural and linguistic, and also political. So this question is still very much a live question. It has not been fully addressed in a sense. But in addition to all of these differences, what I'm really interested in and concerned about is the implications for activism. So self-organized groups may focus on specific body-mind related matters, and as a consequence, they engage in siloed self-organizing that can result in unnecessary divisions. And a divided language inhibits coalitional politics. And language does matter for groups' constitutions. For instance, as an example, UPS mentioned in their own constitution that only people with physical impairments can be full members with decision-making powers. And yet that doesn't, I'm also stressing that their activism and what they have put forward is still worth engaging with very much. And Ellen Clifford provided another example in her book that differences over the naming of the coalition involved in the monitoring of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities in 2017 led certain organizations to pull out. So again, language really matters, and identity-related questions matter because it can lead to siloed self-organizing. And when I asked questions related to identity in my interviews with the research participants for this project, I saw that the differences of understanding and approaches were mirrored in what they said as well. So there is no clear consensus among participants in relation to identification along disability and body-mind lines. The term disabled was used interchangeably with other terms, and then at times it was used exclusively or not at all. Some participants did not use the term disabled due to not wishing to claim the term away from others. So they felt that, for instance, they had pain-free days, and they considered those to be days when they didn't feel disabled. And they felt that other people may have kind of worse experiences of living than them, so they didn't want to take this term away from them. And then research participant Louise, for instance, pointed to the usefulness of having different concepts at one's disposal, so decisions can be made within certain contexts. So you use the identity that best fits the context that you're in. Now, the insights offered by the participants are not part of this paper, but will potentially, if I continue to stay in academia, I might write a second paper that is going to be more empirical focused. However, all participants presented evidence, so regardless of what identities they used or what understanding of disability they had, all of them presented evidence of disablement-related oppression and exploitation. And this represents, in my view, the common material conditions of everyday life for all the participants in this project and others beyond the project. They are all subjected to disablement, which is central to the reproduction of capitalism. And just to recap, some of the reasonings behind the search for a new concept are as follows. So, there is a lack of consensus everywhere among participants and in different spheres of society. I wanted to avoid long lists of different groups of people whilst writing the thesis, but also just because it just creates a lack of clarity and potential divisions, as I mentioned before. I wanted to also avoid imposing the term disabled on those who do not use it, and acknowledge the argument that, for instance, mental distress is not necessarily an impairment, or not for some activists. And also, not everyone who has an impairment or who is chronically ill, for instance, is aware of it, yet they are still subjected to disablement. So being conscious of your subjectivation does not mean that you're not actually experiencing those things. And then I wanted also to build on the UPS-inspired social model, in particular, and combine it with recent Marxist work and link it to class analysis and away from liberal, post-human, postmodern approaches. So in addition to coming up with a new term and theorizing around it, I wanted to embed it within another theory, and I found class composition theory to be most appropriate, and hopefully this will offer an avenue for other researchers to explore class composition theory in relation to disability. I'll just take a sip of water. And I'll proceed to the third part of this presentation. I'm sure everyone here is very aware of class consciousness and class composition theories, so I won't spend very much time on this. But very quickly, class consciousness theory assumes that there is such a thing as class in itself and class for itself. So class in itself represents working class people who are exploited under capitalism, and then class for itself is working class people who are conscious of their class position and organize as such. Thank you, Paul, for your message. Okay. And then we move on to class composition theory, and especially the work of Moran, who, in response to the previous theory, has and others have developed class composition to involve the technical composition of class and the political composition of class. So with the technical composition, we've got working class people exploited under capitalism, so similar to class in itself. And then political composition is working class people who organize themselves politically, but this framework does not presume or does not prioritize consciousness and raising consciousness. It's more about mapping and coalition building. And I thought that was a very interesting insight, which could be also transferred to disability politics. And although the UPS-inspired social modelists do not use explicitly class consciousness theory, I have identified their approaches as fitting quite well within it. So for them, I argue that disability in itself is represented by people with impairments, and disability for itself is represented by disabled people. However, people with impairments, and the term of impairment, as I've mentioned before, is rejected by some subjects of disablement. And also it can focus on impairment as a personal body-mind feature of a person. Impairment is too restrictive, although it can be redefined as I mentioned, Ellen Clifford is doing at the moment. So watch that space. Whereas with disability for itself, we've got disabled people as conscious of the fact that they are disabled, and that is within the disability consciousness theory. And attention then becomes on how to raise consciousness, which I find too psychologizing and potentially hierarchical, because whose role is it to raise consciousness? And arguably, consciousness raising efforts of the UPS-inspired social modelists have had limited gains in the face of neoliberalism. Very, very few people now know about the social model, for instance, and there have been some surveys on this question recently in the UK, and the levels were very low. So in a very comradely fashion, I then sought to come up with an alternative to the disability consciousness theory of the UPS-inspired social modelists by proposing the disability composition theory or approach. So here we've got subjects of disablement as the technical composition of disability, so how people are materially constituted as neurodivergent, impaired, chronically ill, D-deaf, with experiences of mental distress, and very, very importantly, other future identities and body-mind related terms and disability related terms, including, for instance, people with long COVID. And then on the other side, the political composition of disability is represented by disabled people and those who organize themselves politically as mad or creep activists, or who may use other terms. So then the question becomes, how can political coalitions be built between these groups? And what's the political difference between all of these political identities, which is something that I think further research needs to be done to highlight these differences and also their commonalities, and on what basis there could be coalition work. So again, to recap a bit, the subjects of disablement as a term, as a concept, is a non-identitarian analytical concept that reflects the technical composition of disability. This is a term for anti-capitalists to adopt. It highlights structural subjectivation of people who are neurodivergent, chronically ill, who may have impairments and so on, through disabling capitalism, which is a point that is often missed from critical political economy and many other types of research. And I wanted to link subjects of disablement to class composition theory, which I'm hoping that's you're persuaded by. Some of the key points to take away from this paper, before I move on to explore the ways in which I've used it in my project, are as follows. So the UPS-inspired social modelists argue that society disables people, but it is difficult to theorize society. And as such, this is one of the reasons why I would shift the focus to capitalism as disabling the subjects of disablement. And disablement is central and fundamental to the reproduction of capitalism. So there is no such thing as capitalism without disablement, and vice versa. This is not to say that people with impairments, for instance, did not exist before capitalism. This is a criticism that is sometimes made by some scholars who think that this is what a social UPS-inspired social modelists argue, but that's not the case. Rather, they were not oppressed and exploited as a specific collective group. They were subjected to prejudice, but they were not disabled as they are, and we are at the moment. I've tried to tweak the impaired disabled dialectic and turn it into subjects of disablement and disabled people instead, and or mad and creep and so on. And the aim, the ultimate aim, is the self-abolition of the collective identity disabled people and the abolition of disabling capitalism itself. As such, affirmative claims such as "the future is disabled," which is the title of a recent book, which I'm sure is incredibly insightful, but those kind of affirmative terms don't really fit within this framework, because to claim that the future is disabled as a positive thing is problematic, because this future should not be disabled, should be non-disabled, or disablement shouldn't exist. And then finally, I hope that regardless of whether you agree with all the arguments in this paper, the process of thinking around this topic and its questions may have been useful for eliciting your own further critiques of disabling capitalism. And if that is the case, my work here is done and achieved. So that's the paper itself. I think I've got a couple of minutes to go further into the project, which I'm currently still editing. But what do the subjects of disablement do? They are agents, they and we are agents of struggle, and we navigate, negotiate, and negate disabling capitalist social relations that emerge through different forms of work and spheres of activity. So in this project, I try to overcome the privileging of waged work, and I've asked questions about what happens within waged and unwaged work time. And I've identified, as a result, a couple of spheres of activity that the participants engaged in their lives as gig economy workers. One of them is, of course, waged work. The second is work for the state and professionals. So the unwaged work that one is required to undertake in order to access social security or to maintain social security, such as checking in and going to a meeting with a job coach, doing job searches for 30 hours a week, and so on. Another sphere of activity is that of dealing with the individual model of disability through interactions with others and trying to resist or tolerate others' disablism. Assistance and self-assistance work, which others would regard as care work, but I find care work as a concept to be potentially problematic from a disability perspective. So I use Finkelstein's distinction between assistance work and support and care, which is assistance. Finally, I look into subversion and collective activities, so the activities that the participants engaged in through volunteering, for instance, as well as organizing in trade unions, disabled people's organizations, and tenants unions. And finally, I also explore activities that are conducive to resting. And why did I mention all of these spheres of activity? It's because I argue that they contribute to, and the work that is done by the subjects of disablement in these spheres contributes to the reproduction of disabling capitalism, but also to efforts to resist it and potentially ultimately reproduce it, and or move beyond it. So through self-organizing work, for instance, the participants become disabled people, creep, mad, and so on. And that is a form of moving kind of beyond disabling capitalism. And what happens across the spheres, I found the following literatures to be most insightful. The first is the Marxist feminist work transfer thesis, which has been developed by Nona Glaser and Kirsten Munro, and I found it to be absolutely incredibly insightful. And secondly, the Marxist autonomist work of Harry Cleaver, through which we find that work is a mechanism of control. So those who are least resourceful and who may not necessarily be in the sphere of the wage, or who may be undertaking gig economy work, may actually do most work and much more work than those who are waged. And we need to take this matter seriously in our analysis. And my proposals are, in relation to these theories and findings, that work transfer is a process that is under constant struggle. So it happens both from above and from below. We need to resist work across most spheres of everyday life as the work is imposed. And we need to expand prefigurative spheres of activity. And just to end this presentation on a couple of points, I stress that campaigns against social care charges, for instance, or the closures of community centers or campaigns for independent living are an active part of struggles over work against disablement and for prefiguration. So it's incredibly important for trade unionists, as well as political economy scholars and others, to recognize these campaigns as being work-related matters and as being efforts to move beyond disabling capitalism. And any struggles against capitalism are incomplete without embedding structural disablement and its subjectivating processes in analysis and praxis. And on this note, I will end my presentation here, and I think I'm within time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ioana. Excellent presentation, and it is a very, very strong paper. And perhaps if I can say a couple of words about it before we go to the questions that are mounting up. I think this is an incredibly important paper because it is part of a Marxist response to the development of disability politics as an identity politics. And I think that shifting categorization and that disrupting of the specificities of identity of disability without necessarily losing the importance of the particular oppressions, exploitations, and alienations that are visited upon disabled people is an extremely important step forward. I would like it to the way in which social reproduction theory is actually beginning to address and supplant issues of identity. So this is, while a paper with a specific focus, a very, very important interrogation and provocation in order that people begin to think very carefully about how disability studies both prompts radical critiques, but sometimes lives within prevailing orthodoxies. Now, Luke Meehan has a question for us, which is, how have people taken the subjects of disablement label? Is there any difference between how activists and lay people respond to it? Have people told you they find it useful for organizing?
Thank you, Luke. I've had discussion. So one of the things I've done this year is to create because I knew that the article itself is quite potentially dense and it was still under review, I wrote a short report with initial findings of the research project. And in that report, I mentioned matters related to the spheres of activity, as well as the term subjects of disablement, and kind of a summary of how I think it could be used and could be useful. And I sent that report to more than 100 disabled people's organizations, as well as disabled people's caucuses within trade unions, tenants unions, and similar spaces. And I received, and then as a result, I attended a couple of meetings and I exchanged emails, some of which were about the term subjects of disablement in particular. All the comments I've received have been positive, and people were intrigued by it. And in terms of how lay people respond to it, I don't know. So I wouldn't necessarily say that we should use it in everyday life or everyday parlance immediately necessarily, but that it is a useful analytical tool for when we think about the politics of disablement, if that makes sense. So maybe over time it could become more popular, but I wouldn't necessarily advocate for it at the moment as just use this term. It would be most useful for organizations to, or like disabled people's organizations to potentially read the paper or the report, which I've also offered to attend meetings to discuss it, and then see what they think about it and how they relate to it, and whether there could be other terms or other approaches that might be useful and that may have been in a way inspired by this particular paper, if that makes sense. So I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks very much. Ioana Cerasella, who is one of the co-conveners and along with Ioana, a member of the steering group for the Marxism and Disability Network, and we will put up the URL for that for people who want to join that network. Her question is, in respect of both technical and political composition of disability that you theorize, could you say more about how you locate subjects of disablement across the capitalist relations of production and the capitalist relations of social reproduction divide?
Yes, thank you, Ioana. Excellent question. Again, so in the project, I seek to overcome the rigid divide that portrays social reproduction as a sphere that is separate from that of production. That was also reflected in the approach I took during the data production phase of the project. And in other words, social reproduction is not simply confined to the realm of unproductive, unwaged, or to waged and unwaged kind of virtuous life-making work that capitalism does not permeate. It entails instead the reproduction of disabling capitalist society overall. So the kind of the moralizing perspective on social reproduction, such as that presented by SRT, considers certain waged or unwaged work as being done by a section of workers that may be the future agents of dissent and kind of the future vanguard. And I'm not convinced by that argument. To this end, I recommend Kirsten Munro's incredible scholarship on this topic. And as Finkelstein also has argued, what is taken to be care work, which is mostly assumed to be done by non-disabled people, actually entails oppressive and exploitative practices towards the subjects of disablement. And that keeps disabling capitalism intact. So the subjects of disablement, as any other workers, contribute to a variety of spheres of work through which they may reproduce disabling capitalism fully, or resist but ultimately reproduce it, and or move beyond it through collective prefigurative work embedded in mutual recognition and prefiguration. So the task is then to consider ways of expanding the latter and abolishing and or reshaping the other two forms of work and underlying social relations. And this can be done through an anti-productivist and kind of wage abolitionist lens, which I'm seeking to develop myself with the project.
Okay, F. Bernardi, and thank you for joining us, says it's so important to include the impact and continuum of COVID, long COVID plus fears relation to related health complexities. How much did participants relate to this new factor and its social weight?
Thank you. A very topical question. So the project itself was conducted in 2020, which was at the start of the pandemic. However, I didn't ask, because the design of the project was done prior to the pandemic starting. I did not integrate much or many questions related to COVID, and I made that like a conscious decision. So COVID was mentioned, of course, at times, but unprompted. So on that basis, then I'm trying to see if I can address the question. How do participants relate to this new factor and its social weight? It would be difficult to answer this question, I would say. Participants did talk about kind of the ways in which COVID or like policies related to COVID affected their or influenced their working lives. And to give you an example, there was one participant only who was on furlough, even during the height of the initial phase of the pandemic. And they mentioned how being on furlough and being away from other co-workers and people on the way to work was a transforming experience for them, because they felt that they had finally had time to cook, to think about self-care, to think about various things, and to do the diary for the project as well, which they found at times cathartic as well as a chore. But it was completely different, and they realized just how much the working experience of outside of the COVID time and era was incredibly stressful and disabling, and as a result they wanted to make changes to their lives to make sure that some of these elements that were available through the furlough scheme and through not being physically at work could be incorporated. So I hope that answers the question to an extent.
I mean, just to carry on in that vein for a moment, sorry. One of the things that struck me about that question was it raises the issue of how disability is constituted in an identity in law and culture. And you, of course, have responded to that using Moran's work. And it's nice to see Raymond Williams' inspired work being used. But I suppose part of what's being said here is, to an extent, people often conjure disability as an identity related to physical disability. How far does this analysis have the same impact in relation to neurodiversity? And how far does it have the same impact in relation to things such as COVID, which until they developed were seen as illnesses as opposed to disabilities, but perhaps that definition has shifted? And I suppose from my point of view, one of the things that shows is the porousness and complexity of the identity which you are both dissolving and incorporating into your sort of Marxist analysis. What would your response be to that incredibly complicated and garbled response?
Thank you. So, for instance, long COVID and people with long COVID have had a very difficult time being recognized as disabled, and have organized incredibly well to push for changes in the law, as well as in society's perception of what long COVID is, and so on. So, and this is very important work, and of course expanding the legal identity of what it means to be disabled or chronically ill is already happening. And at the same time, I would say that for Marxists who are interested in processes of exploitation and oppression through capitalism and disablement, we don't need to wait until the state or a medical professional gives their stamp and approval that a particular newly developed condition is something on the basis of which people are disabled through capitalism. We can already be much more open and welcoming of in our praxis, as well as in our kind of theorizing, of people with new experiences who make claims to processes of disablement and who make claims to being disabled. So I'm not trying to replace any identity with the subjects of disablement term. And this is also a response to Luke from earlier on. That's why I've highlighted that subjects of disablement is a non-identitarian term. It's an analytical term that we can still make use of, precisely so we can go beyond kind of either personal identity or collective identity and so on.
Okay, thank you. Luke is just adding a question for us. Let me quickly load it so that you are able to see it, Ioana. And I will read it for the audience who haven't immediately got text in front of them. Luke says, related to Paul's question, could you talk a little about how and why the technical composition may change over time? In Autonomism, it's quite simple. Boss changes work patterns. But as Paul points out, there seem to be multiple inputs, state, environment, market, etc., in the development of an impairment.
Thank you very much, Luke. I will highlight once again Ellen Clifford's work, because she's working on creating a social model of impairment, and I think that work will address this question in a way. But basically, yes. So the environment and the way in which capitalism is organized and reproduced and organized society and so on, that changes the technical composition of disability. So with environmental disasters and with changes to, for instance, through austerity measures and so on, more and more people become disabled or become subjected to disablement in new ways or in the same way, but like more, just the number is expanded. So this is something that needs to be taken into account, and that's why empirical research is incredibly important here, and we need to take into account these changing external factors, as well as the identity-related questions that are related to them.
Okay. One of the other impressive aspects of your work is the praxeological construct of it. And you're very deliberate from the start. As somebody who spends far more time than I should on theory, I'm impressed by what you're doing. But you make at pains to talk about the praxeological. How would your analysis change the way in which collectively we organize or protest against that subjectivation of this disablement?
Thank you. I'll just write a couple of notes quickly.
Of course.
So I guess two things are worth mentioning, especially. One is that organizations, as well as scholars, who are anti-capitalist and Marxist, should really put disablement at the center of their analysis and not as an addition, and also they need to shift their approach from the individualizing approach, which is mostly which reproduces capitalism itself, to this more collectivist approach. that I'm putting forward here and also in the future potential paper. So that's a starting point for these organizations. And of course, what's also important is for the subject of disablement to have decision-making powers within the structures of these organizations that are at the moment not inclusive enough. And then in terms of disabled people's organizations and caucuses within trade unions and so on. Oh, and I'll mention trade unions as well. It's very important, again, to move past using identity as the primary way into one's politics, in a way, or coalition building. So that's why, and identity is still very important. Of course, it has its own value, but by moving beyond whether or not, are we a chronic illness based organization only, or are we, how do we make links to our understanding of disabling capitalism and how to move beyond it, and how can we organize coalitionally with other groups, again, whilst not forgetting what the real enemy is. And then thirdly, trade unions and other work-related organizations really need to look beyond what's happening within the workplace and to recognize the unwaged work that is being done by the subjects of disablement as being very important in being addressed, and it needs to be reduced, abolished, or reframed if we are to change and fundamentally restructure the institution of work which oppresses us all.
I suppose as well, I should ask you to say something about the way in which, while we're focusing on disabled organizations, disabled politics, and that subjectivation of disablement and the construction of identities, we should also say something about the relative lack or deficit of Marxist analysis around disability, which is why your work is extremely important, because it's trying to make a theoretical contribution in an area where it's all too often been neglected. Do you want to say something about that?
Yes, thank you. I guess the productivism that is found in some Marxist scholarship is especially problematic because, and also the focus or the primacy of the work that happens within the sphere of the wage. Those are two elements that I found problematic when I was doing my own research, and that I tried to move beyond by engaging with feminist Marxist and autonomist Marxist scholarship. And yeah, often the subjects of disablement are presented or feature within Marxist texts as not really contributing to production and social reproduction, and that is an incredibly problematic way of thinking about things, and it also dismisses and is not even curious to explore the work that is actually done by the subjects of disablement, and also how can we create coalitions to and how can we think about organizing around the issues that and the work that is happening within those particular spheres. So for instance, having to go to the job center and to try to show that your claims to disability are legitimate, and then having to also undertake work which may be triggering chronic illness flare-ups and so on. Those are very, very important things that are happening in the lives of millions of people. And yet there is quite an absence of reflection on this within Marxist texts. So again, using autonomist Marxist, feminist Marxist, Black Marxist, and also the UPS-inspired social model in particular would be a good way forward, I would say.
Okay, I suppose it's only fair to ask a critical question that might come from somebody who is advocate of the social model as it stands, or somebody even who subscribes to crip theory, which is there a danger, however sophisticated your analysis, and anyone reading the paper will see it as sophisticated, is there a danger what we are seeing here is the subordination of the distinctiveness of disabled struggle, exploitation, oppression, alienation within a class analysis? And it's a sort of classic critique that people have always raised with Marxism. Feminists have raised it in relation to class over gender, anti-racists in terms of class over race. Is there something to that criticism in your view, and how would you respond to it?
Thank you very much. Really good question. Of course, my answer is no, but I find it problematic that class and capitalism have been sidelined within disability studies, and my aim then is to address that kind of absence, first and foremost. And then secondly, there's any theory that does not include class or does not think through class, or in a way that has a good understanding of class, in my view, is not a theory that is concerned with radically and structurally and fundamentally changing the social relations in which we are living. So, of course, this concept or the concepts or the arguments made in this paper will not be of much value to those unconcerned with the questions that I'm asking in this paper, and I can live with that. But I don't think I am subordinating disability-related matters under class. I'm thinking through both at the same time. And I see, of course, I won't remember now the quote very well, but in relation to, for instance, race, Stuart Hall said that race is a modality through which class is lived. And in the same way, I think disability is a modality, is a social formation and modality through which class is lived, and the other way around. So you cannot artificially separate the two when we live in a capitalist society. There is no such thing as, I don't know, social spaces that are outside of capitalism, and as such, we need to collectively organize in the spaces we're at.
Okay, we appear to be running out of questions, so what I'm going to ask is one final question, and then we'll draw it to a close. I'm sure the article will be well received. I'm sure it's already been well received. Based on your work now and its initial responses, where do you go next with this? You can have a day off, of course, but after that day off.
Thank you. So there is forthcoming, if I understood your question well, so there is a forthcoming paper in a disability-related journal that I'll be revising it and resubmitting within a few months. And apart from that, I intend to submit my thesis next year in spring, probably, and from there on, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know if I'll stay in academia necessarily in an academic role, but basically what I would like to do is to make as much of the ideas within this project available and kind of engaging and useful to others beyond it. So I'll be looking into various avenues in which I can do that, potentially through a book or reports and engagements through events such as this one and others. So yeah, that's kind of my plan. Okay, thanks very much, Ioana. That was a lovely presentation, and I think the discussion and the questions from the audience actually moved it forward very nicely. So thanks very much indeed. And thank you for those of you who have viewed this. I'm sure it will get many more views, as our videos tend to do over the next month.
For those of you who are interested in this, we have a Marxism Disability Network. I have put the website up on the YouTube chat, and that network has monthly seminars. Do you know offhand, Ioana, when the next one is?
I think it is on the 19th of September at 6:30 p.m.
Thank you very much. If you go to the website, you will see the details of the next broadcast. We hope you come and see that. And of course, see more of Ioana's work as she works it through the network. Everybody is welcome. Thanks very much for listening. Thanks very much, Ioana. Hopefully some of you will join us again at 5 o'clock when we are going to talk with Rosemary Hennessy concerning her new book, In the Company of Radical Women Writers. Until 5 o'clock, thank you very much and have a good afternoon.